The dust settled around Willa Jennings' worn boots as she stood before the burned remains of what had once been her father's mercantile. And the only thought racing through her mind was whether anything in this God-forsaken world could be trusted at all. Hill City, Dakota Territory, sprawled before her in the harsh summer of 1877, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence in the Black Hills. The gold rush had brought fortune seekers and swindlers in equal measure, and Willa had learned the hard way that distinguishing between the two was nearly impossible. Her father had trusted the wrong partner, signed the wrong papers, and now he lay in the cemetery on the hill while she stood amid the ashes of everything he had built. She was 22 years old and owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a stubborn streak wider than the Missouri River, and a mind that refused to accept anything at face value. Every promise seemed hollow. Every kindness appeared to hide ulterior motives. Every smile looked like the prelude to betrayal. "Miss Jennings." The voice came from behind her, low and careful, as though its owner understood that startling her might provoke an unpleasant reaction. Willa turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving toward the small knife she kept hidden in her skirt pocket. Trust no one had become her motto, and she lived by it religiously. The man standing 10 feet away was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in the kind of trail dust that spoke of long days in the saddle. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark eyes watching her with something that looked almost like concern. He was perhaps 25, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that rested easily near his belt. A cowboy, clearly, though his gun sat high on his hip rather than low and tied down like a gunfighter's would. "Do I know you?" Willa's voice came out sharper than she intended, but she did not apologize. Sharp kept people at a distance, and distance kept her safe. "No, madam. Name's Harrison Alden. I worked for your father about 3 years back before I took a job driving cattle up to Montana. Just got back to Hill City yesterday and heard about the fire." He paused, and something in his expression softened. "Heard about your father, too. I'm real sorry for your loss." Willa's jaw tightened. Condolences were cheap. Everyone offered them, and then everyone disappeared when actual help was needed. "Thank you for your kind words, Mr. Alden. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." She turned back to the ruins, hoping he would take the dismissal for what it was. Instead, she heard his boots crunch on the debris-strewn ground as he came closer. "I also heard you've been having trouble," he said quietly. "That Frank Morrison's been pressuring you to sell him this land." Willa's spine stiffened. Frank Morrison owned the saloon, the hotel, and half the mining claims in the area. He had offered her money for her father's property, money she desperately needed, but the offer had come with strings she did not want to examine too closely. Morrison had a reputation for acquiring property from desperate people at prices far below their worth, then reselling at enormous profit. More than that, the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. "Mr. Morrison has made an offer, yes," she said, her voice tight. "It's none of your concern." "You're right, it's not," Harrison agreed, surprising her. "But I owe your father a debt. He gave me work when I needed it most, and he didn't ask questions about where I'd come from or what I'd done before. That kind of kindness stays with a man." Willa turned to face him fully now, studying his features with the suspicious scrutiny she applied to everything. His face was honest enough, she supposed, with strong features and eyes that met hers directly. But her father had thought Frank Morrison's partner honest too, right up until the man had disappeared with half the mercantile's cash. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Alden?" "I'm proposing that you not make any hasty decisions. Morrison's offer is probably a fraction of what this property's worth, especially with the railroad talking about extending a line through here. And I'm proposing that if you need help rebuilding, or if Morrison gives you any trouble, you've got someone in your corner." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they sent alarm bells ringing through Willa's mind. No one offered help without expecting something in return. That was the first lesson the world had taught her, and it had been reinforced a dozen times since her father's death. "In exchange for what?" she asked bluntly. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry, in exchange for what?" Willa repeated, crossing her arms. "What do you want from me, Mr. Alden? A share of the property? Marriage to a landowner? Or perhaps you're working for Morrison yourself, trying to gain my trust so you can convince me to sell?" Something flickered across Harrison's face, an emotion Willa could not quite identify. Hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. But he did not look away, did not bluster or protest too loudly. Instead, he simply said, "None of those things, Miss Jennings. But I can see you've got no reason to believe me, so I won't waste your time trying to convince you otherwise. If you need help, I'm staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street. If you don't, I wish you well." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, and Willa felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been regret. She crushed it immediately. Regret was for people who could afford to trust, and she was not one of them. The next 3 days passed in a blur of frustration and mounting desperation. Willa visited the bank, only to be told that her father's debts exceeded any assets she might claim. She visited the land office, where a board clerk informed her that without clear title and the means to develop the property, she would likely lose it to tax sale within 6 months. She visited the few merchants her father had counted as friends, and found sympathy but no concrete assistance. Everyone was struggling. Everyone had their own problems, and a young woman with no family and no prospects was, it seemed, on her own. Frank Morrison appeared at her boarding house on the 4th day. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, with slicked-back hair and clothes too fine for Hill City's dusty streets. The smile he gave Willa was meant to be reassuring, but succeeded only in making her want to slam the door in his face. "Miss Jennings, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, voice oily with false concern. "I wanted to follow up on our previous conversation about your property." Willa stood in the doorway, deliberately not inviting him inside. "Mr. Morrison, I've told you I need time to consider my options." Of course. But time is something you don't have much of, I'm afraid. The bank has informed me they'll be foreclosing within 60 days unless the debts are cleared, and my offer is the only realistic solution to your predicament." The fact that he knew about the bank's timeline before she had been officially notified sent cold suspicion trickling down Willa's spine. "How do you know about the foreclosure?" Morrison's smile never wavered. "I make it my business to stay informed about opportunities in Hill City. Now, I'm prepared to increase my offer by $50, which I think is more than generous considering the circumstances. That money could see you comfortably relocated to Denver or Cheyenne, where a young lady of your qualities might find suitable employment or perhaps even a husband." The condescension in his tone made Willa's hands curl into fists. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. Morrison. Now, if you'll excuse me." She started to close the door, but Morrison's hand shot out, holding it open. The false friendliness slipped from his face, replaced by something harder and far less pleasant. "Don't be foolish, Miss Jennings. You have no options here. No family, no prospects, and no chance of developing that land on your own. Take my offer while it still stands." "The lady asked you to leave." The new voice came from the street behind Morrison, and Willa's heart gave a small, traitorous leap when she recognized Harrison Alden's measured tone. The cowboy stood at the base of the boarding house steps, thumbs hooked in his belt, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and alert. Morrison turned, his expression darkening. "This doesn't concern you, Alden. Miss Jennings asked you to leave. That makes it my concern." Harrison's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the quiet words. "Now you can walk away on your own, or I can help you. Your choice." For a long moment, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Then Morrison smiled again, though it did not reach his eyes. "Of course, I wouldn't dream of imposing. Miss Jennings, my offer remains open for another week. After that, I'm afraid circumstances will force me to withdraw it." He brushed past Harrison and strode down the street, his expensive boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Willa watched him go, then turned her attention to the cowboy still standing at the bottom of her steps. "I didn't need your help," she said, hating how ungracious she sounded but unable to stop herself. Accepting help meant incurring debts, and debts gave people power over you. "I know," Harrison said simply, "but I figured you'd have trouble getting rid of him without making a scene, and scenes tend to give men like Morrison excuses to cause more problems." He tipped his hat again. "Good day, Miss Jennings." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Willa standing in her doorway with a confusing tangle of emotions knotted in her chest. Frustration that he had interfered, relief that Morrison had left, suspicion about Harrison's motives. And underneath all of it, a tiny, dangerous spark of something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. That evening, as Willa sat in her small rented room trying to calculate impossible sums that might somehow save her property, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Sarah Bennett, the boarding house owner, holding a covered plate. "Harrison Alden asked me to bring this up to you," Sarah said, her weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "Said he noticed you hadn't come down for dinner and thought you might be hungry." Willa stared at the plate as though it might contain poison. "Did he say what he wanted in return?" Sarah's smile faded into something sadder. "Oh, honey. He paid for the meal and left, didn't ask for anything, didn't leave any messages, just wanted to make sure you ate." She pressed the plate into Willa's reluctant hands. "Not everyone's got an angle, you know. Some folks are just decent." After Sarah left, Willa set the plate on her small table and stared at it for a long time. Steam rose from beneath the cloth, carrying the rich scent of beef stew and fresh bread. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she had, in fact, skipped both breakfast and lunch while wrestling with her financial problems. She questioned everything. Why had Harrison really sent the meal? What did he hope to gain? Was this the first step in some elaborate scheme to win her trust and then exploit it? But even as these thoughts circled through her mind, she found herself lifting the cloth and taking a bite of the stew. It was good, seasoned with care and still hot. Someone had put thought into this meal, and regardless of motives, her body needed food. The internal war between suspicion and necessity exhausted her more than physical labor ever could. The following morning, Willa woke with new determination. She would not be passive in her own fate. If the property was going to be taken from her, she would at least understand every detail of how and why. She dressed in her most severe dark dress, pinned her auburn hair into a tight bun, and marched down to the land office with her father's papers clutched in her hand. The clerk, a thin man named Peters who looked like he had never smiled in his life, barely glanced up when she entered. "Miss Jennings, back again. I want to review the exact legal status of my father's property," Willa said firmly. "All documents, all claims, all debts. I have a right to see everything." Peters sighed with the weariness of a man perpetually inconvenienced by other people's problems. "Miss Jennings, I've already explained that the situation is quite straightforward. The debts exceed the property value, and therefore, then you should have no trouble showing me the specific documents that prove this," Willa interrupted. Unless there's something you'd prefer I didn't see. The slight hardening of Peter's expression told Willa she had struck a nerve. Good. She was tired of being patted on the head and dismissed like a confused child. Very well. Wait here. He disappeared into the back office, and Willa used the time to study the maps on the walls, noting property lines and ownership records. Hill City had grown rapidly since gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and the resulting tangle of claims and counterclaims had made more than one lawyer wealthy. Her father had owned a prime corner lot on what was becoming the main commercial street. If the railroad did come through, that property would be worth 10 times Morrison's offer. Peters returned with a folder that looked suspiciously thin for the comprehensive records Willa had requested. He spread the papers on the counter with obvious reluctance. The deed, the bank notes, and the outstanding debts. Willa read through each document carefully, her father's training serving her well. He had taught her to read contracts and spot inconsistencies, skills he had said were essential for anyone in business. As she studied the papers, a cold knot of anger formed in her stomach. This debt notation, she said, pointing to a figure that represented more than half of what was supposedly owed. It's attributed to Franklin Morrison as a private loan, but I never saw any record of this in my father's books. When was this loan supposedly made? Peters shifted uncomfortably. 2 weeks before the fire. Your father needed capital for inventory. My father kept meticulous records. He would have documented any loan. Willa's voice was sharp now, cutting. I want to see the original loan document with my father's signature. Miss Jennings, I don't have time for, then make time. Willa planted both hands on the counter and leaned forward. Because either that document exists and can be produced, or someone is attempting to defraud me. Either way, I want answers. The door to the land office opened behind her, and Willa glanced back to see Harrison Alden entering. He took in the scene with a quick, assessing look, then moved to stand slightly behind and to the side of Willa. He did not say anything, did not interfere, but his presence added weight to her demand. Peters looked between them, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he said, "The document is on file with the bank. You'll have to take this up with them." "Then I will," Willa said. She gathered her father's papers and turned to leave, then paused. "And Mr. Peters, if I discover that you've been complicit in any fraudulent claims, I'll make sure everyone in Hill City knows about it. Your reputation will be worth less than the dirt under my boots." Outside, the morning sun was already beating down with the relentless heat of a Dakota summer. Willa took a deep breath, trying to calm the fury shaking through her limbs. She was so focused on her anger that she almost forgot about Harrison until he spoke. "You handled that well." Willa turned to face him, her defenses immediately snapping back into place. "Were you following me, Mr. Alden?" "No, madam. I had business at the land office myself, but I'm glad I arrived when I did. Peters is in Morrison's pocket, and you backing him into a corner like that took courage." "I don't need your approval," Willa said, but the words lacked heat. She was too tired for another confrontation, and if she was being honest with herself, having someone witness her small victory felt better than it should have. Harrison nodded, accepting her statement without argument. "Where are you headed now?" "The bank. I need to see this supposed loan document." Willa started walking, and Harrison fell into step beside her without asking permission. She should have told him to leave her alone, but instead she found herself saying, "Do you think Morrison forged my father's signature?" "I think Morrison saw an opportunity when your father died and decided to take advantage of it," Harrison said carefully. "Whether that means forgery or just creative interpretation of verbal agreements, I couldn't say. But men like him don't get rich by playing fair." They walked in silence for a moment, Then Willa asked the question that had been nagging at her since Harrison first appeared. "Why do you care, Mr. Alden? You said you owed my father a debt, but giving someone a job 3 years ago doesn't usually inspire this kind of loyalty." Harrison was quiet for long enough that Willa thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more personal than she had heard it before. "Your father didn't just give me a job. He gave me a second chance. I came to Hill City running from some bad choices I'd made in Wyoming. Had a reputation as a troublemaker and a drifter, and most folks wouldn't hire me even to muck out stables. Your father listened to my story, looked me in the eye, and said everyone deserves a chance to prove they're more than their worst mistake." Willa felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the walls she had built so carefully. "What happened? Why did you leave?" "Got offered a job as a trail boss for a big Montana outfit. Good pay, a chance to build a real reputation. Your father encouraged me to take it, said I'd earned the opportunity. I always meant to come back and thank him properly, but cattle drives don't leave much time for visiting." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I regret that I didn't make the time." They had reached the bank, a solid brick building that was one of the few structures in Hill City built to last. Willa paused at the door, turning to face Harrison fully. "I question everything, Mr. Alden. Every motive, every kindness, every word. It's how I survive." "I know," Harrison said quietly. "And I don't blame you for it. The world's given you plenty of reason to doubt. But I want you to know that I'm here because it's the right thing to do, not because I expect anything from you. Whether you believe that or not is up to you." Willa studied his face, searching for the lie, the hidden agenda, the telltale signs of manipulation she had learned to recognize. But all she saw was steady patience and a quiet sincerity that made her want to trust him even as her mind screamed warnings. "Why did you send me dinner last night?" she asked abruptly. Harrison blinked at the sudden change of subject, then a slight smile touched his lips. "Because you looked like you were carrying the weight of the whole territory on your shoulders, and I figured you'd forget to eat while you were busy trying to solve all your problems at once." Sometimes the simplest answer is the true one, Miss Jennings. Before Willa could respond, the bank door opened and a well-dressed man emerged. He stopped when he saw them, his expression cooling. "Miss Jennings, Mr. Alden, can I help you with something?" Cyrus Wilkes, the bank manager, was a careful man who had built his career on being friendly with everyone while committing to no one. Willa had dealt with him several times since her father's death, and each conversation had left her feeling like she was trying to nail smoke to a wall. "I need to see the documentation for the loan Frank Morrison supposedly made to my father," Willa said without preamble. "Including the original signed agreement." Wilkes' expression became even more neutral, which was itself revealing. "That's confidential bank business, Miss Jennings. I'm not at liberty to share private financial records. Those records concern my father's estate, which makes them my business," Willa countered. "And if you're unwilling to produce them, I'll have to wonder why. What exactly are you hiding, Mr. Wilkes?" "I'm not hiding anything. But there are proper procedures that must be followed. If you'll submit a written request." "How long will that take?" Harrison asked, his voice mild but his eyes sharp. Wilkes turned his attention to the cowboy, clearly weighing whether Harrison represented a complication he could afford to ignore. "Several weeks at least, perhaps longer. Which would conveniently take us past Morrison's deadline for his offer," Willa said. Anger was giving her courage, burning away the fear that usually kept her cautious. "How much is Morrison paying you, Mr. Wilkes? Or does he have some other hold over you?" The bank manager's face flushed. "Miss Jennings, I'll thank you not to make baseless accusations. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have appointments to keep." He brushed past them and hurried down the street, moving faster than Willa had ever seen him move before. She watched him go, frustration warring with a grim satisfaction. Wilk's reaction had confirmed her suspicions, but it also meant she was fighting a system designed to protect men like Morrison. "This isn't going to be easy," Harrison said quietly. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Willa replied. She was surprised to realize she meant it. The prospect of fighting for her father's legacy, of refusing to be bullied and manipulated, had ignited something in her that had been dormant since his death. Fear still twisted in her gut, and doubt still whispered that she would fail, but underneath both was a growing determination that felt almost like hope. Harrison looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You're not what I expected, Miss Jennings. What did you expect?" "Someone more willing to give up," he admitted. "Most people would have taken Morrison's offer by now just to escape the pressure, but you're fighting." "Why?" Willa considered the question seriously. It was not really about the property, though that mattered. It was not even entirely about justice for her father, though that mattered too. "Because if I let Morrison win, if I let fear and doubt control my choices, then I'm admitting that the world is exactly as terrible as I suspect it is. But if I fight, then maybe, just maybe, there's still room for things to be different, for people to be decent, for trust to be possible." She had not meant to be so honest, and the vulnerability of her words made her immediately defensive. "That probably sounds naive to you." "No," Harrison said softly. "It sounds brave." They stood there on the wooden sidewalk, the noise of Hill City flowing around them, wagons creaking past, miners arguing over claims, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Willa felt something shift between them, a connection being forged despite her resistance. It terrified her. It also felt like the first real thing that had happened to her in months. "I need proof," she said, forcing her mind back to practical matters. "Proof that the loan is fraudulent or that Morrison is manipulating the foreclosure process. Without that, the law won't help me." "Then we'll find proof," Harrison said with simple confidence. Willa wanted to point out that he kept saying "we" when he had no obligation to be involved at all. She wanted to question his motives again, to push him away before she started depending on him. But instead, she heard herself saying, "Thank you." The words felt strange in her mouth, rusty from disuse. Harrison's expression softened, and for just a moment, Willa allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to trust someone. Really trust them, the way her father had trusted his business partner before that trust had been betrayed. The way her mother had trusted the doctor who had promised he could save her, but had taken their money and left her to die anyway. Trust was a luxury Willa could not afford. But as she looked at Harrison Alden's patient, steady face, she found herself wanting to try anyway. Over the following week, Willa learned that fighting corruption in a frontier town was like trying to dam a river with her bare hands. Every person she approached either worked for Morrison, owed him money, or feared crossing him. The deputy marshal was useless, more interested in keeping the peace than ensuring justice. The town's two lawyers both claimed conflicts of interest that prevented them from taking her case. Even the newspaper editor, who should have been interested in exposing wrongdoing, politely declined to publish anything that might be considered libelous. Through it all, Harrison remained a constant, quiet presence. He did not push himself into her life or demand her gratitude. Instead, he simply appeared when she needed help carrying heavy ledgers from the land office, standing silently supportive during hostile meetings, occasionally offering suggestions but never insisting on them. His patience was remarkable, especially given Willa's continued suspicion and frequent rudeness. "You should probably give up on me," she told him one evening as they sat outside the boarding house watching the sun paint the Black Hills gold and purple. I'm not very good company, and I'm likely to lose this fight anyway. Harrison stretched his long legs out and tilted his head back, his profile sharp against the sunset. I'm not here because you're good company, though for the record, I don't mind your company at all. I'm here because you need someone in your corner and I can afford to be that someone. Can you? Willa asked. You must have your own work, your own life. Trail driving season isn't over. Why aren't you in Montana? I saved my wages, Harrison said. Have enough to get through the winter without working. And as for my own life, well, I've spent the last 5 years drifting from job to job, living out of a bedroll and generally avoiding putting down roots. Helping you feels more meaningful than anything I've done in a long time. Willa wanted to dissect that statement, to question whether he was trying to create a sense of obligation or manipulate her emotions. But she was tired of always being suspicious, always looking for the trap. Just for a moment, she let herself accept his words at face value. I went to my father's grave today, she said quietly. First time since the funeral, I wanted to tell him I was fighting for what he built. But standing there, all I could think about was how he trusted the wrong people and it destroyed him. How do you know, Harrison? How do you know when trust is wisdom and when it's just foolishness? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I don't think you ever really know for certain. Trust is always a risk. But I think the question isn't whether to trust, it's who to trust and how much. Your father wasn't foolish for trusting people. He was unlucky that his trust was betrayed. There's a difference. Is there? Willa pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling evening air. Because from where I stand, the outcome looks the same. The outcome was bad, Harrison agreed. But the alternative is living like you're living now, questioning everything, keeping everyone at arm's length, exhausting yourself by treating the whole world like a threat. That's not surviving, Miss Jennings. That's just a slower kind of dying. The words hit harder than Willa expected, stirring something painful in her chest. You don't understand what it's like, she said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. You haven't been betrayed the way I have. Haven't I? Harrison turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were darker, shadowed by old pain. I told you I came to Hill City running from bad choices. What I didn't tell you was that those choices involved trusting my brother with money we'd both saved, money that was supposed to buy us a ranch together. He gambled it all away, then skipped town and left me to face the people we owed. I spent 2 years working off those debts, and by the time I was clear, I'd learned to trust no one. Willa stared at him, genuinely surprised. He had seemed so steady, so confident in his faith in human decency. Then how did you get past it? How did you learn to trust again? Your father, Harrison said simply. He took a chance on me when no one else would. And yeah, I was suspicious at first, waited for the catch, the moment when he'd reveal what he really wanted. But it never came. He was just a decent man doing a decent thing. That taught me that while betrayal is real, so is kindness. Both exist, and I get to choose which one I look for. Choosing to look for kindness sounds like a good way to get hurt again, Willa said. Probably, Harrison agreed. But choosing to only see threats is a good way to miss out on everything that makes life worth living. Friendship, community, love. He paused, and something in his voice changed, became more personal. You, Willa's breath caught, me. These past weeks, watching you fight for what's right even though you're terrified, seeing you question everything including your own doubts, listening to you think out loud, watching the way your mind works through problems. Yeah, you're remarkable, Willa Jennings, and I'd have missed knowing you if I'd let your suspicion or my own wariness keep me away. No one had ever said anything like that to Willa before. No one had seen past her prickly defenses to the person underneath. She wanted to dismiss his words, to find the manipulation in them, but she could not. They rang with too much sincerity, too much quiet conviction. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in. What if you're lying? What if this is all some elaborate scheme and I'm falling for it because I'm lonely and desperate?" "Those are fair questions," Harrison said. He shifted slightly, angling his body toward her without moving closer. "And I can't prove I'm telling the truth any more than I already have. But I can keep showing up. I can keep answering your doubts with patience, and eventually, maybe you'll see that time and consistency are harder to fake than pretty words." "Patient devotion," Willa murmured. "What? That's what you're offering?" "Patient devotion to proving yourself trustworthy, even though I give you nothing but suspicion in return." "Why would anyone do that?" Harrison smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. "Because you're worth it. And because I'm starting to suspect that underneath all that questioning and doubt is someone I could love." The word hung in the air between them, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Willa's heart hammered against her ribs. She should get up and walk away. She should protect herself before she got in too deep. She should do anything except what she was actually doing, which was sitting frozen on this bench while something warm and dangerous unfurled in her chest. "I'm not easy to love," she warned. "I've noticed," Harrison said, amusement coloring his tone. "But then, nothing worth having ever is." Before Willa could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. Voices raised in anger, the crash of breaking glass, and then a woman's scream. Harrison was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip with practiced ease. Willa stood too, her heart now racing for entirely different reasons. They hurried toward the noise, which was coming from the Lucky Strike Saloon, one of Morrison's properties. A crowd had gathered outside, and through the open doors, Willa could see furniture overturned and men shouting. Harrison pushed through the crowd with Willa close behind him, and they emerged into a scene of chaos. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, was backed against the bar with Morrison looming over her. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and her face was marked by a fresh bruise. 3 of Morrison's men formed a semicircle, keeping the other patrons back. The woman looked terrified but defiant, her chin raised even as her whole body shook. "You signed a contract, Sally," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "You work for me until that debt is paid, and if you're unhappy with the arrangements, well, that's your problem, not mine." "I didn't sign anything," the woman Sally shot back. "You gave me forged papers after you'd gotten me drunk. That contract's not legal." "Who's going to believe a saloon girl over an upstanding businessman?" Morrison smiled, and it was the ugliest expression Willa had ever seen. "Now stop making a scene and get back to work. The lady says she didn't sign your papers." Harrison's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Every head turned toward him, and Morrison's expression darkened when he saw who had spoken. "Alden, this is private business. Stay out of it. Private business that involves forcing a woman to work against her will." Harrison moved forward slowly, his hands visible and away from his gun, but his posture radiating quiet menace. "That sounds like a matter for the law." "The law is on my side," Morrison said confidently. "I have a signed contract." "Then you won't mind if a judge reviews it," Willa said, stepping up beside Harrison. She looked at Sally, whose eyes had widened with desperate hope. "Miss, did this man forge your signature?" Sally nodded quickly. "Yes. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure I couldn't work anywhere in the Black Hills. I don't have any family, nowhere else to go." The story was sickeningly familiar. This was Morrison's pattern: find vulnerable people, trap them with false debts or forged documents, and exploit them. Willa's father had probably been just one in a long line of victims. "You're making a mistake, Miss Jennings," Morrison said, turning his cold eyes on Willa. "Interfering with my business affairs is a bad idea, especially when you have so many problems of your own." "Is that a threat?" Harrison asked quietly. Morrison's smile returned. "Just a friendly warning. Now I suggest you both leave before this situation becomes unpleasant." The three men behind Morrison shifted, their hands moving toward their weapons. The room held its breath, balanced on the edge of violence. Willa's mind raced. They could not win a fight against 4 armed men, but they could not just abandon Sally either. There had to be a way out that did not end in bloodshed. "Deputy Wade is right outside," she said, gambling that the deputy's preference for avoiding trouble would work in their favor. "I'm sure he'd be interested in reviewing your contract and hearing Miss Sally's accusations, unless you'd prefer to resolve this quietly." It was a bluff. Deputy Wade would almost certainly side with Morrison, but the saloon owner could not be sure of that. For a long moment, Morrison stared at Willa with an expression of pure hatred. Then, slowly, he stepped back from Sally. "Fine. Take her if you want her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. But this isn't over, Miss Jennings. Not by a long shot." Harrison moved to Sally's side, offering his arm for support. The girl took it gratefully, nearly collapsing against him. Together, the three of them left the saloon, the crowd parting silently before them. Outside, the evening air felt impossibly clean after the smoke and tension of the lucky strike. "Thank you," Sally gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you so much. I thought I'd never get away from him." "You're safe now," Willa said, though she was not certain it was true. Morrison did not strike her as someone who let perceived insults go unavenged, but worry about that could come later. Right now, Sally needed help. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" Sally shook her head miserably. "Morrison owns the building where I had a room. He'll have thrown all my things out by now." "You can stay at my boarding house," Willa decided. "I'll speak to Sarah. She's good people and she'll help." As they walked Sally to the boarding house, Willa was intensely aware of Harrison beside her. They had just made a powerful enemy together, had stood side by side against injustice, despite the personal risk. It felt significant, like they had crossed some invisible line that could not be uncrossed. Sarah Bennett took one look at Sally's bruised face and ushered her inside without hesitation, clucking over her like a mother hen. After getting the girl settled with hot water and a meal, Willa and Harrison found themselves standing in the boarding house parlor, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly fading. "That was foolish," Willa said, but there was no heat in the words. "We've made everything worse." "Maybe," Harrison agreed. "Or maybe we've just drawn the battle lines clearly. Morrison's been operating in the shadows, using fear and legal tricks to get what he wants. Now everyone knows he's willing to forge documents and threaten women. That knowledge is power. Or it's just a faster way to lose everything." Willa sank into one of Sarah's comfortable chairs, suddenly exhausted. "I questioned whether we should help Sally. For just a moment, I calculated whether saving her was worth the risk to my own situation. What kind of person does that make me?" Harrison sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "It makes you human. It makes you someone who's been hurt and is trying to protect herself. But you know what else you did? You helped her anyway. You questioned your doubt and then you chose kindness despite the cost. That takes more courage than blind faith ever could." "You always have an answer," Willa said, but she was smiling despite her exhaustion. "Every doubt I raise, every fear I voice, you meet it with patience and perspective. Don't you ever get tired of it? Not even a little bit, Harrison said. His eyes held hers, warm and steady in the lamplight. Willa, I meant what I said earlier. I'm starting to fall in love with you. The questioning, the stubborn independence, the fierce intelligence, all of it. You don't have to trust me or love me back. But I want you to know that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Willa's throat tightened with emotion she did not know how to name. What if I never stop questioning? What if I never fully trust you? Then I'll keep answering and I'll keep being trustworthy, Harrison said simply. For as long as it takes. In that moment, sitting in the warm glow of Sarah's parlor with danger lurking outside and an uncertain future ahead, Willa made a decision. It was small, barely more than a shift in perspective, but it felt monumental. She chose to believe him. Not blindly, not without reservations, but consciously and deliberately. She chose to accept that his patient devotion might be exactly what it appeared to be, genuine care for her well-being with no ulterior motive. I'm scared, she admitted. I know, Harrison said. I might question everything again tomorrow. I expect you will. But right now, in this moment, I want to try trusting you. Willa stood, crossing the small space between them, and held out her hand. Thank you for helping Sally. Thank you for standing beside me. Thank you for your patience. Harrison took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. He stood too, and suddenly they were very close, close enough that Willa could see the darker flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice low and rough. Every instinct screamed at Willa to pull away, to protect herself, to question his motives and her own judgment. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a yearning for connection, for trust, for the possibility that not everyone would betray her. Yes, she whispered. Harrison's kiss was gentle, questioning, seeking permission even though she had already granted it. His hand came up to cup her face with a tenderness that made Willa's chest ache. She leaned into him, letting herself feel the moment without analyzing it to death. His lips were soft, his touch careful, as though she were something precious and fragile. When they parted, Willa's heart was racing and her thoughts were chaos. But underneath, the familiar fear and doubt was something new, a tiny ember of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. I'm still going to question things, she said. Harrison smiled, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. I'm counting on it. The next morning brought new complications. Willa woke to find a notice slipped under her door. Morrison had officially called in her father's supposed debt and was demanding immediate payment or surrender of the property. The deadline was 3 days away. Willa read the notice 3 times, her hands trembling with anger and fear. 3 days. After all her fighting, all her determination to save her father's legacy, she had 3 days to come up with money she did not have or lose everything. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Harrison already waiting in the dining room. He took one look at her face and set down his coffee cup. What happened? Willa handed him the notice without speaking. She watched him read it, saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow cold in a way she had not seen before. When he looked up, there was steel in his gaze. All right, he said. Then we stop playing by Morrison's rules and start making our own. What does that mean? It means we find proof of Morrison's fraud and we find it fast. And if the local law won't help, we go over their heads. Harrison stood, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. The Territorial Marshal's office in Yankton handles cases of major corruption. If we can document Morrison's pattern of fraud, your father's forged loan, Sally's false contract, any other victims we can find, we can make a case that supersedes local jurisdiction. Hope flickered in Willa's chest, but caution immediately dampened it. That would take weeks, and we have 3 days. Then we work fast, Harrison said. He reached out and took her hands, his touch grounding her. "Willa, I need you to trust me on this. Not blindly, not forever, just for the next 3 days. Can you do that?" Willa looked into his eyes, searching for doubt or deceit. All she found was determination and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel less alone than she had in months. "Yes," she said, "I can try." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Harrison proved to have unexpected resources, friends from his cattle-driving days who owed him favors, contacts in other towns who had dealt with Morrison's business practices, and a sharp mind for investigation that rivaled any detective. Together, he and Willa tracked down 3 other people who had been cheated by Morrison, including a widow who had lost her boarding house to a mysteriously inflated debt. Sally proved to be an invaluable ally. She knew Morrison's business operations intimately and was able to point them toward discrepancies in his bookkeeping. More importantly, she knew where Morrison kept his private papers in a safe in his office above the Lucky Strike. "We need to get into that safe," Harrison said on the evening of the second day. They were gathered in Willa's room with Sally and the 3 other victims, surrounded by papers and testimony. "If Morrison keeps copies of the forged documents, that's our proof." "Breaking into his office is illegal," Willa pointed out, even as part of her mind was already working through the logistics. "So is fraud," Harrison countered. "We're not doing this for profit or revenge. We're gathering evidence of crimes that the local authorities refuse to investigate." "There's a difference." Willa looked at the faces around her. Sally with her fading bruise, Mrs. Patterson, who had lost her boarding house, Tom Chen, whose mining claim had been stolen through false debt, Maria Rodriguez, whose restaurant had been burned after she refused Morrison's protection money. "All victims, all people the system had failed, all right," she said. "But we do this carefully and we do it right. If we get caught, everything we've worked for falls apart." Harrison smiled at her, and in his eyes was something that looked like pride. "I love the way your mind works. Questioning whether we should, then figuring out exactly how if we must." They made their plan carefully. Morrison spent every night from 7 to midnight at the Lucky Strike, holding court at his private table and conducting business. His office would be empty but locked. Sally knew that Morrison kept the safe key on a chain around his neck, but she also knew the safe was an older model that a skilled locksmith might be able to open. The problem was that Hill City's only locksmith was Morrison's cousin. "I can open it," Tom Chen said quietly. All eyes turned to him, and the young Chinese man flushed under the attention. "My father was a locksmith in San Francisco. He taught me the trade before I came to the Black Hills to mine. I still have his tools." "Are you sure?" Willa asked. "If Morrison catches you, he'll do more than just steal your claim." Tom's expression hardened. "He's already taken everything else. My claim, my savings, my reputation. The only thing I have left is the chance to stop him from hurting anyone else. I'm sure." They chose the 3rd night, the deadline day, for their attempt. Morrison would be distracted by the expectation of claiming Willa's property, and the Lucky Strike would be busy enough that one missing person would not be immediately noticed. Tom would pick the lock on Morrison's office door, open the safe, and photograph the documents using equipment borrowed from the newspaper office. The whole operation needed to take less than 30 minutes. Willa and Harrison's role was to keep Morrison occupied at his table, preventing him from going upstairs for any reason. It was a simple plan with 1,000 ways to go wrong. That evening, Willa dressed in her best gown, a deep blue silk she had worn to a dance years ago, before her father's death had made such frivolities impossible. Sarah helped arrange her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun, and when Willa looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Harrison's reaction when she came downstairs confirmed that the effect was striking. He stared at her with open admiration, then caught himself and cleared his throat. "You look beautiful. But you know Morrison's going to interpret your presence at the saloon as interest, right? He's going to think you've given up and are there to negotiate surrender." "Good," Willa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let him think that. Overconfident men make mistakes." They entered the Lucky Strike just after 7, and every head turned to watch them cross the room. Morrison was indeed at his usual table, and his expression when he saw Willa was equal parts surprise and triumph. He stood, gesturing grandly for them to join him. "Miss Jennings, Mr. Alden, this is unexpected. I thought you'd be home packing your belongings." "I wanted to discuss your offer one more time," Willa said, taking the seat Morrison held for her. She forced herself not to flinch when his hand brushed her shoulder. "To see if we might reach a more equitable arrangement." Morrison's smile was smug. "I'm afraid my offer has been withdrawn. At midnight, your property becomes mine through foreclosure, but I might be persuaded to let you stay on as a tenant for a reasonable rent." Willa bit back the angry retort that rose to her lips. Instead, she smiled and leaned forward slightly. "Surely we can come to some understanding. You're a businessman, Mr. Morrison. Surely there's room for negotiation." For the next 20 minutes, Willa played her part perfectly. She flattered Morrison's business acumen, questioned his terms with just enough deference to stroke his ego, and generally kept his attention completely focused on her. Harrison sat beside her, his presence a silent support, occasionally asking questions that prolonged the conversation. Upstairs, unknown to Morrison, Tom Chen was carefully picking the lock on the office door while Sally kept watch in the hallway. Maria and Mrs. Patterson waited outside with a wagon, ready to spirit Tom away if anything went wrong. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Willa was running out of questions to ask, running out of ways to keep Morrison talking. She could see Harrison growing tense beside her, his hand drifting toward his gun in an unconscious gesture of readiness. Then Sally appeared at the top of the stairs and gave a small, deliberate cough, the signal that Tom was finished. Relief flooded through Willa so intensely she felt dizzy. "I need to think about this," she said, standing abruptly. "It's a significant decision, and I won't be rushed into it." Morrison's expression darkened. "You have until midnight, Miss Jennings, not a moment more." "Then I'll give you my answer at midnight," Willa said. She turned and walked toward the door with Harrison beside her, fighting the urge to run. They had done it. They had actually done it. Outside, the cool evening air felt like absolution. Tom was already in the wagon with Maria and Mrs. Patterson, the camera equipment safely hidden beneath a tarp. Sally slipped out a side door moments later, and they all hurried back to the boarding house, where they could develop the photographs in safety. The images Tom had captured were damning. Morrison's safe had contained copies of multiple forged documents, detailed ledgers showing fraudulent debt claims, and even a ledger listing bribes paid to local officials, including Deputy Wade and Cyrus Wilkes at the bank. It was enough evidence to bury Morrison and everyone in his corrupt network. "We need to get this to the territorial marshal immediately," Harrison said. "But sending it by telegram isn't secure, and the stage doesn't leave until morning." "I can ride to Yankton," Tom offered. "I'm a good rider and Morrison doesn't know I was involved." "I can get this evidence to the marshal's office before Morrison realizes what happened." "It's dangerous," Willa warned. "If Morrison suspects anything, he'll send men after you." Tom's smile was grim. "I've been in danger since the day Morrison stole my claim. At least this way I'm fighting back." They prepared the package of evidence carefully, including written testimonies from all of Morrison's victims. Tom left within the hour, riding one of Harrison's horses, the fastest mount they could acquire. As they watched him disappear into the darkness, Willa felt the weight of hope and fear pressing equally on her chest. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. "What if the territorial marshal is corrupt too? What if Morrison has too much power?" Harrison put his arm around her shoulders, and Willa let herself lean into his warmth. "Those are valid questions, but we've done everything we can. Sometimes you have to take action despite uncertainty. That's what faith is, not the absence of doubt, but the choice to move forward anyway." They returned to the boarding house to wait. The hours until midnight crept by with painful slowness. Sarah made tea that no one drank. Sally paced the parlor like a caged animal. Mrs. Patterson and Maria sat together, holding hands and praying quietly in Spanish. And Willa stood at the window watching the street, half expecting Morrison's men to come breaking down the door. Harrison stood beside her, a solid presence in the darkness. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said softly. "I'm thinking that a week ago, I would never have attempted something this risky. I would have questioned it until I talked myself out of acting, then lost the property through inaction. But you being here, believing in me, made me brave enough to fight." Willa turned to look at him, memorizing the strong lines of his face in the lamplight. "Whether we win or lose, I want you to know that you changed something fundamental in me. You answered my doubts with such patient devotion that eventually I had to start believing in the possibility of goodness." Harrison cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Willa Jennings, you were already brave. You were already strong. You were already remarkable. All I did was stand beside you while you remembered those things about yourself." He kissed her then, and it was different from their first kiss. Deeper, more certain, carrying the weight of everything they had been through together. Willa kissed him back, pouring into it all the gratitude and affection and tentative trust she was learning to feel. When they parted, she was breathless and her heart was racing, but it was not fear causing the sensation. "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping before her usual caution could stop them. "I question everything, including my own feelings, and I'll probably doubt this 100 times. But right now, in this moment, I know I love you." Harrison's smile was radiant, transforming his whole face. "I love you too, and I'll remind you of this moment every single time you question it. Patient devotion, remember." The church bell tolling midnight interrupted them. The deadline had passed. Officially, Morrison could now claim ownership of Willa's property. But the game was not over yet. The next morning brought news that spread through Hill City like wildfire. The territorial marshal had arrived at dawn with 6 armed deputies. Morrison, Deputy Wade, and Cyrus Wilkes had all been arrested on charges of fraud, forgery, bribery, and extortion. Tom Chen had ridden through the night and presented the evidence personally to Marshal Davis, who had immediately recognized the scope of the corruption and acted. By noon, the marshal's office had announced that all property claims based on Morrison's fraudulent debts were being invalidated pending full investigation. Willa's father's property was safe. Sally was free. Mrs. Patterson would get her boarding house back. Tom would have his mining claim restored. Maria could reopen her restaurant without fear. Justice, it seemed, was still possible. Harrison and Willa stood amid the celebration at the boarding house, watching their friends embrace and cry with relief. Marshal Davis had requested statements from all of them, and the process would take weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Morrison's empire had collapsed, and the people he had victimized were finally free. "You did this," Harrison said to Willa. "You refused to give up, refused to let fear control you. This victory belongs to you." Willa shook her head. We did this, all of us together, but I never would have found the courage without you. She laced her fingers through his, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. What happens now? Now we rebuild, Harrison said. Your father's mercantile, Sally's life, Tom's mining operation, all of it. The town has a chance to be better than it was. I meant us, Willa clarified. What happens with us? Harrison turned to face her fully, his expression serious but his eyes warm. That depends on what you want. I told you I'm not going anywhere, and I meant it. I'd like to stay in Hill City, help you rebuild the mercantile if you'll have me. Maybe invest in it as a partner if you trust me with that, but I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. Willa considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind the way she examined every important decision. A month ago, she would have found a dozen reasons to refuse, 100 potential problems with binding her life to someone else's. But she was learning that questioning everything did not mean rejecting everything. Sometimes the questions led to yes instead of no. I want you to stay, she said. I want to rebuild my father's business with you as my partner, and I want to see where this goes between us. I'll probably question your motives and my own judgment regularly. I'll definitely have moments where my old fears resurface and I push you away. But I want to try building something together, a business, a life, a future. That sounds perfect to me, Harrison said. He pulled her close, and Willa let herself relax into his embrace, feeling the solid reality of his presence. I'll answer every doubt, every fear, every question you have for as long as you need me to. That might be forever, Willa warned. I certainly hope so, Harrison replied. Over the following months, Hill City transformed. With Morrison's corrupt influence removed, honest businesses began to thrive. The railroad did extend a line through town, exactly as Harrison had suspected, and property values increased substantially. Willa's father's corner lot became one of the most valuable commercial locations in the territory. Rebuilding the mercantile was hard work. Willa and Harrison labored side by side, clearing rubble, ordering inventory, and slowly bringing the store back to life. Sally proved to have a remarkable head for numbers and became their bookkeeper. Tom invested some of his mining profits in expanding the mercantile to include mining supplies. Maria opened her restaurant in a building Morrison had previously controlled, and it quickly became the most popular eatery in Hill City. Through it all, Harrison remained exactly what he had promised, to be patient, devoted, and unfailingly supportive. When Willa had moments of doubt, when old fears made her question whether she could really trust him, or whether disaster was waiting around every corner, he listened without judgment and reminded her gently of every promise he had kept, every obstacle they had overcome together. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect. Harrison never pushed for more than Willa was ready to give, and Willa found herself giving more than she had ever thought possible. They were partners in business, in the rebuilding of Hill City, and increasingly in life. 1 year after Morrison's arrest, on a crisp autumn morning with the Black Hills blazing with gold and red foliage, Harrison proposed. They were standing on the site where the mercantile had once been ashes, but now stood solid and prosperous. The sign reading Jennings and Alden General Store gleaming above the door. I know you'll question this, Harrison said, holding out a simple gold ring. You'll wonder if I'm sure, if you're sure, if we're rushing into things or if marriage will somehow ruin what we have. So I want to answer those doubts before you even voice them. I'm absolutely sure. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. We're not rushing. We've spent a year building a partnership that's stronger than most marriages I've seen. And marriage won't ruin what we have because what we have is based on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that grows deeper with time. I want to spend the rest of my life answering your questions and earning your trust every single day. Will you marry me?" Willa looked at the ring, then at Harrison's face, and realized that her habitual doubts were there but quieter now, more like background noise than the screaming sirens they used to be. She had questioned everything about this relationship from the beginning, and Harrison had met every doubt with patient devotion. He had proven himself trustworthy 100 times over in ways large and small. "Yes," she said, and the word came easier than she expected. "I'll probably have doubts on our wedding day. I'll probably question things throughout our marriage. But I know that I love you, and I know that you'll be there with patient answers every single time." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a passion tempered by tenderness. Around them, Hill City bustled with afternoon activity, their friends, their neighbors, the community they were helping to build together. Willa felt connected to all of it in a way she never had before, rooted and secure in a way that had nothing to do with property or money, and everything to do with belonging. They married in the spring of 1878, in a simple ceremony at Hill City's church. Sally was Willa's maid of honor, and Tom stood up as Harrison's best man. Maria catered the celebration, and half the town attended, testament to the respect Willa and Harrison had earned through honest business practices and genuine care for their community. On their wedding night, as they lay together in the room above the mercantile that they had converted into living quarters, Willa voiced one more question. "What if I'm not good at this? Being a wife, trusting completely, letting someone see all my weaknesses?" Harrison pulled her closer, his hand tracing gentle patterns on her shoulder. "Then we'll learn together. Willa, I don't need you to be perfect or to never doubt. I fell in love with you exactly as you are, questioning, cautious, brilliantly skeptical mind and all. That's not going to change just because we're married." "You're very patient," Willa murmured, relaxing into his warmth. "I'm very in love," Harrison corrected. "There's a difference." Their life together unfolded with its share of challenges and triumphs. The mercantile prospered, growing to employ 6 people and serving customers from throughout the Black Hills. Harrison's instincts for business proved excellent, and Willa's attention to detail and inability to accept anything at face value made them impossible to cheat or manipulate. They were a formidable team. 2 years into their marriage, Willa became pregnant. The realization filled her with as much fear as joy, and she spent weeks questioning whether she was ready for motherhood, whether she could protect a child in a world that still seemed threatening, whether she could teach someone to trust when she still struggled with it herself. Harrison listened to every fear and answered with his characteristic patience. "You'll be an amazing mother. You'll teach our child to be careful without being afraid, to question without being paralyzed by doubt, to trust the people who prove themselves trustworthy. And you won't do it alone. We're partners in this, just like everything else." Their son was born in the winter of 1880, a healthy boy with his mother's auburn hair and his father's steady brown eyes. They named him Thomas Andrew Alden, after Tom Chen, who had risked everything to help them, and Willa's father Andrew, who had started the whole journey by showing Harrison kindness years before. Holding her son for the first time, Willa felt terror and love in equal measure. This tiny person was entirely dependent on her, entirely vulnerable to the world's cruelties. But as she looked up at Harrison, who was gazing at their son with awe and fierce protectiveness, she realized that her child would grow up with something she had lost young: a family built on trust and love, people who would stand beside him through any challenge. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Harrison said, sitting beside her on the bed and putting his arm around both his wife and son. but we'll figure it out together. Patient devotion works for parenting too. As their son grew, Willa discovered that motherhood brought its own questions and doubts. Was she holding him too much or not enough? Were her fears making her overprotective? Was she teaching him to be cautious or just passing on her own anxieties? But Harrison was always there with gentle perspective, reminding her that questioning her choices meant she cared about making good ones, and that their son was thriving under their combined care. Sally married Tom Chen in 1881, a beautiful ceremony that symbolized how far they had both come from the desperate victims they had once been. Willa stood up as Sally's matron of honor and felt profound gratitude that they had all found happiness after such difficult beginnings. 3 years after Thomas was born, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose, after the boarding house owner who had helped them, and because Rose had been Willa's mother's middle name. Sarah was a curious, fearless child who inherited her mother's questioning nature and her father's steady patience, a combination that promised interesting teenage years ahead. The mercantile continued to grow, eventually expanding into a second building and offering everything from mining equipment to fine fabrics imported from San Francisco. Harrison had been right about the Railroad Hill city's population tripled between 1877 and 1885, and businesses that had established themselves early prospered. But more important than financial success was the life Willa and Harrison built together. Their home above the mercantile was filled with laughter and love, with children's voices and friends gathering for meals. Willa still questioned things it was too fundamental to her nature to ever completely disappear, but the questions had changed character. Instead of asking, "Why should I trust this?" she found herself asking, "How can I make this work?" Instead of "What's the hidden motive?" she asked, "What's the best solution?" And through it all, Harrison remained her anchor. Patient when she doubted, steady when she feared, supportive when she questioned herself. His devotion never wavered, and eventually, Willa's trust in that devotion became as solid as the Black Hills themselves. On their 10th anniversary, they stood together on the porch of the house they had built just outside Hill City, a proper home with room for their growing family, and a view of the mountains that took Willa's breath away every single morning. "You remember when I told you I questioned everything?" Willa asked, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "I remember," Harrison said, his arm tightening around her waist. "I still do," Willa admitted. "But somewhere along the way you became the exception. I don't question your love anymore. I don't doubt your loyalty. I don't wonder if you'll be there tomorrow or next year or when we're old and gray. You answered every single doubt with such patient devotion that eventually I ran out of questions." Harrison turned to face her, his eyes bright with emotion. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me." "Don't get used to it," Willa teased. "I'm sure I'll find something to question by dinner." Harrison laughed, the deep, genuine sound that Willa had learned meant he was truly happy. "I'm counting on it. Life would be boring if you stopped questioning everything." They kissed as the sun set over the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Behind them, through the open door, they could hear their children playing, their voices high and happy. Inside was warmth and security, a life built on the foundation of trust earned and love proven. Willa had spent years believing that questioning everything was the only way to stay safe. But Harrison had taught her a different truth, that the right questions could lead to connection rather than isolation, that doubt tempered with trust could become wisdom, and that patient devotion could answer even the most stubborn fears. As they stood together watching darkness fall over the Dakota Territory, Willa reflected on how far she had come from the angry, frightened woman standing in the ashes of her father's mercantile. That woman had been so alone, so convinced that trust was weakness, and everyone had ulterior motives. She had questioned everything because she was terrified of being hurt again. But Harrison had shown her that some things were worth the risk, that the possibility of love was worth the vulnerability, that building a life together was worth the fear of loss. And most importantly, that her tendency to question everything was not a flaw to be overcome but a strength to be honored and balanced with courage. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked softly. "I'm thinking about how you saved me," Willa said. Harrison shook his head. "No. You saved yourself by being brave enough to trust. I just stuck around long enough for you to see it was safe." "Patient devotion," Willa murmured, smiling. "Always," Harrison promised. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to study law, inspired by Marshall Davis's Pursuit of Justice in Hill City. Sarah proved to be naturally talented at business and spent hours at the mercantile, learning every aspect of the operation. A third child arrived in 1887, another boy they named Harrison Andrew Alden, called Andy to distinguish him from his father. Through it all, Willa and Harrison remained partners in the truest sense. They made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, and built a life that honored both their individual strengths and their combined bond. When Willa questioned, Harrison listened. When Harrison needed support, Willa provided it. Their marriage was not perfect, no marriage is, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won trust that made weathering difficulties possible. The mercantile continued to thrive, eventually becoming the largest general store between Rapid City and Deadwood. Harrison's patient business practices and Willa's insistence on fair dealing earned them a reputation that drew customers from throughout the territory. When Dakota was admitted to the Union as two states in 1889, Jennings and Alden General Store was one of the established institutions that gave Hill City its character and stability. Sally and Tom had 4 children of their own, and their families spent holidays together, creating the kind of extended family connections that made Hill City feel like home rather than just a place to do business. Mrs. Patterson ran her restored boarding house until she passed peacefully in her sleep at age 73, leaving the property to Sally and Tom, who continued her legacy of providing safe, affordable housing to newcomers. Maria's restaurant became famous throughout South Dakota for authentic Mexican cuisine, and she eventually opened a second location in Rapid City. She never married, claiming that her restaurant was husband enough, but she was godmother to half the children in Hill City and as much a part of the community as anyone. As Willa moved through her 30s and into her 40s, she found that the questions that had once consumed her had transformed into a healthy skepticism that served her well in business and life. She taught her children to think critically, to ask for evidence, to not accept things at face value, but she also taught them that some things, like the love of family and the loyalty of true friends, could be trusted absolutely. Harrison aged gracefully, his dark hair silvering at the temples, but his steady presence never wavering. He remained Willa's anchor, the person she turned to when doubts crept in, the partner who knew her better than anyone and loved her not despite her questioning nature, but because of it. On their 20th anniversary, Harrison surprised Willa with a gift, a leather-bound journal filled with his handwriting. "What is this?" she asked, turning the pages and seeing entry after entry dated across their years together. "Every doubt you've voiced since I met you," Harrison said, his eyes crinkling with affection. "And my answer to each one. I thought you might like to see the pattern, how your questions have changed over the years, how we've grown together. Also, it's proof that I really do have patient devotion. I counted I've answered over 3,000 questions in 20 years. Willa laughed, tears pricking her eyes as she flipped through the pages. There they all were, her fears about Morrison, her doubts about Harrison's motives, her questions about business decisions and parenting choices, and 1,000 other concerns, large and small. And beside each one, Harrison's thoughtful response, his gentle perspective, his unwavering support. "This is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done," Willa said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a woman who values evidence," Harrison said, pulling her close. "I wanted to give you concrete proof that I've been here for every question, every doubt, every moment you needed reassurance. And that I always will be." That evening, as they sat together reading through the journal, Willa was struck by how much had changed. The woman who had questioned Harrison's motives for sending her dinner seemed like a stranger now, so locked in fear and suspicion. But that woman had also been brave enough to accept help, to fight for justice, to slowly open her heart despite every instinct telling her to remain closed. "You know what I love most about this?" Willa asked, indicating the journal. "It shows that you never tried to stop me from questioning. You never told me I was being silly or too suspicious. You just answered every single time until I found my own path to trust. That's because your questions were never the problem," Harrison said. "They were your way of protecting yourself, of making sense of a world that had hurt you. I knew that if I could meet each question with truth and consistency, eventually you'd see that I was safe, that we were safe. We really are, aren't we?" Willa said wonderingly. "After everything Morrison, the corruption, building the business, raising the children, all the challenges and changes were solid. I don't question us anymore, Harrison. Not at all." Harrison kissed her temple gently. "That's not quite true. You questioned whether Andy should go to Denver for school just last week." "That's different," Willa protested. "That's about Andy's safety and education, not about whether I trust you." "Exactly," Harrison said. "Your questions evolved. You still question things, but now it's practical concerns and real problems, not whether the people you love will betray you. That's growth, Willa. That's healing." As they continued into their 50s and 60s, Willa and Harrison gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations of the mercantile. Sarah took over management, proving to be an even shrewder businesswoman than her mother. Thomas finished law school and returned to Hill City to open a practice, where he specialized in protecting small property owners from the kind of fraud that had once threatened his mother. Andy studied engineering and helped bring electricity to Hill City in the early 1900s. Harrison's hair turned completely white, but his eyes remained sharp, and his devotion to Willa never dimmed. They spent their later years traveling, occasionally seeing San Francisco and Denver, visiting Thomas in law school, attending Andy's wedding in Chicago, but always returning to Hill City, which had become home in the deepest sense. Willa's auburn hair silvered too, and arthritis made her hands ache on cold mornings, but her mind remained sharp. She volunteered at the library, mentored young women starting businesses, and wrote a memoir about the early days of Hill City that became required reading in local schools. On their 40th anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends both old and new, Willa stood to make a toast. "40 years ago, I was a frightened young woman who trusted no one and believed the world was fundamentally hostile. Then this man," she gestured to Harrison, who was watching her with the same steady patience he had shown from the beginning, appeared in my life, and proceeded to answer every single doubt I raised with such patient devotion that eventually I had to accept that maybe just maybe, love was real and trust was possible. Harrison Alden, you saved my life not by rescuing me but by standing beside me while I learned to save myself. Thank you for 40 years of answered questions and unwavering support. I love you. The room erupted in applause and happy tears. Harrison stood and kissed his wife, and in that kiss was everything they had been through together: the fear and doubt, the challenges and triumphs, the gradual building of trust and the deep, enduring love that had grown from it. That night, lying in bed in the house they had built together, Willa voiced one more question. "Do you think we've had a good life?" Harrison turned to look at her, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "What do you think?" "I think," Willa said slowly, "that we've had exactly the life we built together. Not perfect, but honest. Not without fear, but full of courage. Not without questions, but with answers freely given. Yes, Harrison, I think we've had a very good life." "Then that's all the answer needed," Harrison said, pulling her close. They fell asleep as they had for 40 years, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the love they had built through patient devotion and hard-won trust. Outside, Hill City slept too. The town they had helped build and improve, the community that had become their legacy. Willa had questioned everything, and Harrison had answered every doubt with patience. In doing so, they had created something rare and precious: a love built on truth, strengthened by challenges, and deep enough to last a lifetime. And in the end, that was all either of them had ever really needed. The final chapter of their story came quietly, as the best endings often do. They passed within months of each other in their 80s, surrounded by the family they had raised and the community they had helped build. Harrison went first, gently in his sleep, after a long, full life. Willa followed soon after, as though her questioning nature could not accept a world without his patient answers. At their joint memorial service, the church was packed with 4 generations of family and friends whose lives they had touched. Thomas spoke about how his parents had taught him that justice was worth fighting for. Sarah talked about learning business from 2 people who valued fairness over profit. Andy recalled his father's patience and his mother's sharp mind working in perfect partnership. But it was their oldest grandchild, Thomas's daughter Emma, who perhaps captured the essence of their relationship best. "Grandma Willa used to tell me that she questioned everything, even love. And Grandpa Harrison would always smile and say, especially love. That's the most important thing to get right. But what I saw growing up was 2 people who had answered life's biggest questions together: what makes a good marriage, how to build a meaningful life, whether trust is worth the risk. And their answer was always the same: choose each other every single day. Question the doubts but trust the love. That was their legacy, and that's what they gave to all of us." As the service ended and people filed past the paired caskets, someone noticed that their hands had been positioned to touch, fingers intertwined even in death. It was Sarah who had requested that detail, remembering how her parents had always held hands while working through problems, while making decisions, while simply sitting together in companionable silence. The tombstone they shared was simple but perfect: Harrison Alden, 1852–1935, and Willa Jennings Alden, 1855–1935. She questioned everything. He answered with patient devotion. Together they found truth. And so their story ended as it had begun, with questions and answers, doubt and devotion. Fear transformed into trust through the simple, powerful act of showing up every single day and choosing love over suspicion. Hill City continued to grow and change, but Jennings and Alden General Store remained a landmark until the 1950s, a testament to what 2 people could build when they combined questioning intelligence with patient faithfulness. The house they built still stands on the outskirts of town, occupied now by their great-great-grandchildren, who have heard the story of how their ancestors met, fought corruption, and built an empire on honesty and trust. In the end, Willa Jennings learned that questioning everything did not mean trusting nothing. It meant being thoughtful about where to place your faith, careful about who earned your loyalty, and brave enough to accept love when it proved itself worthy. And Harrison Alden learned that patience was not passive waiting but active devotion, showing up, answering questions, proving trustworthy through consistency rather than grand gestures. Their love story was not the wild, passionate romance of novels. It was better a real love between real people, built on a foundation of respect and trust that had been earned rather than assumed. It was a love that asked questions and provided answers, that acknowledged doubt while choosing faith, that recognized the risks of trust while embracing them anyway. And that, in the end, was the truest romance of all.